Hi, my name is Patrick. I'm here with my colleagues Shannon and Juan. We're students at Dalhousie University in the Department of Biology, and this is our research project on Point Pleasant Park's recovery and succession after the 2003 Hurricane Juan disturbance. So a bit of introduction and background on our research project. Hurricane Juan hit the Nova Scotian shore in 2003. More than 80,000 trees were toppled in Point Pleasant Park alone. Some terminology that we might use. Secondary succession is the recolonization of a habitat after a major disturbance. Species richness is the number of species in an ecological community. Species diversity is the measure of the number and relative abundance of the different species in that ecological community. And your climax community is the ecological community that has reached a state of equilibrium and stability. So in 2004, the Department of Biology at Dow took advantage of the major disturbance to kind of answer some questions about succession and recovery that we wanted answered. So one of those questions was how the overall forest community changed over time and what would happen to the overall community as the forest moves towards its climax community. And our hypothesis behind that was to measure species diversity and the species diversity in the forest should see a steady increase in early years and then level off once it gets closer to the forest climax community. Another question we had was how has the density of the dominant species in 2004 as well as the dominant species in the future, in this case 2023, has changed over time, and what would happen to those dominant species and the community as the forest moves towards its climax community. And so we figured that the dominant species in 2004 should see an increase in the very first few years and continue to increase at a consistent slower rate afterwards. The dominant species in 2023 should see an exponential increase in abundance and then level out once the forest reaches its climax community. And our last question was how the species richness has changed over time and what would happen to the species richness as the forest moves towards its climax community. And we hypothesized that the species richness should see a steady increase followed by a plateau in the forest intermediate stages before slowly decreasing once the forest gets closer to its climax community. So starting in 2004, students and experts at Dalhousie University in the Department of Biology went to 5 different 20 square meter sites at Point Pleasant Park in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Data was collected of the tree species and their abundance in those 5 different sites. Species were identified visually by experts, and they defined a tree as a wood growth that is 2.5 centimeters in diameter at breast height. Data collection happened every year at the same 5 sites since 2004, other than 2005, 2007, 2016, and 2020 because of some major disturbances.
Over time, the forest community in Point Pleasant Park has made evident recovery. It has become both more diverse and more mature, and this can be seen here in Figure 1. As the years continue, the Shannon diversity value rises, and a higher value means a greater diversity. The p-value also resulted in 2.0 times 10 to the power of -7, which is an extremely small value and results in evidence to support the alternative hypothesis, which is that there is a significant change in diversity of the forest, and further reject the null hypothesis, which is that there is no change in diversity. As the F-statistic for this data is 33.6, it is statistically significant and further supports the rejection of the null hypothesis. Overall, this data suggests a big change and increasing diversity, and in the future, it may continue this way for a period of time until it becomes a mature old-growth forest. Once it reaches this climax stage of succession, diversity is likely to remain stable as the forest will have a fixed state with species that are long-lived and constant, and because of this and the ecological relationships of all types of plants and trees in this community, there's less opportunity for new species to develop.
So as you can see here, we have our graphs of red spruce and red maple population abundances. And what these answer is our question on how the density of the dominant species in 2004, the red spruce, and the dominant species in 2023, the red maple, have changed over time and what would happen to them. So in the past 20 odd years, both dominant species have made obvious recoveries. The former, being the red spruce, has increased its numbers at a steady rate. This is illustrated in figure 2.1. As the years progress, so does the red spruce's abundance. The p-value for the red spruce population was quite small at 0.004, which supports the alternative hypothesis that there was an increase in population abundance and rejects the null hypothesis that there's no change in the spruce population. The F statistic for this data is 8.72, which is statistically significant and supports the rejection of the null hypothesis. The red maple has had an even more successful recovery, leading it to be the most dominant species in 2023. This can be shown in figure 2.2. The red maple's population abundance increases significantly as the years pass. The p-value for the red maple's population was extremely small at 7.9 times 10 to the negative 5, which supports the alternative hypothesis that there was an increase in population abundance and rejects the null hypothesis that there was no change in red maple populations. The F statistic for this data is 17.4, which is statistically significant and further supports the rejection of our null hypothesis. The data suggests a big change in dominant species over the past 20 years. According to the statistics, we'll likely see a continued dominance of the red maple when the forest reaches its climax community, and if it continues to dominate the area, we will likely see a red maple dominated Acadian forest type.
Species richness. Following Hurricane Juan in 2003, the overall species richness has steadily increased despite variations across multiple sites, as shown in Figure 2. After the use of linear regression analysis on data collected in 2023, the p-value obtained was 2.2 times 10 to the power of negative 16, leading to the rejection of the null hypothesis that there is no change in species richness at Point Pleasant Park over time, and the acceptance of the alternate hypothesis that species richness should see a steady increase as Point Pleasant approaches its climax community. Furthermore, the F statistic obtained was 142.2, which is also significant in supporting the alternate hypothesis. Our R-squared value obtained was 0.66, representing a relatively small difference between observed data and the linear regression model. Following the chronosequence model that was used by Ed et al. In 2000, it is likely that species richness will continue to increase and plateau during its late intermediate stage before slowly decreasing. As Point Pleasant reaches its climax community, red spruce abundance as well as red maple abundance should rise, increasing canopy cover and limiting light penetration to the soil. As a result, species that don't grow very tall and require larger quantities of light will struggle to compete for resources, such as light, against the likes of the red spruce and the red maple. As Point Pleasant Park approaches its climax community and canopy cover increases, the amount of species should see a small decrease before finding a state of equilibrium.
Alright, so based on the data, the current succession stage would likely be intermediate or mid-stage. There are grasses and shrubs that are evident, as well as many fast-growing coniferous and younger, slow-growing deciduous trees that are present. And it's obvious that these trees are not fully mature when we take the measurements into consideration. The succession and recovery of this Acadian forest in Point Pleasant Park may be affected by many things, and one thing in particular is its separation from other more developed forests, also known as fragmentation. An urban forest is often heavily interacted with by humans and pets, leaving less space for wildlife, populations to flourish and grow, and with less access to wildlife for fertilization, seed distribution, things like that. Reforestation is likely to take longer, and the establishment of animal and plant interactions in a forest is a very important aspect of a healthy ecosystem. As Point Pleasant Park is located in a hotspot of movement with ships and trains, it is also very vulnerable to the introduction of invasive species. From even before Hurricane Juan, Point Pleasant Park had been suffering from brown spruce longhorn beetle, likely from the ships. And this is an issue because it will attack the young trees, inhibiting healthy growth, which makes reforestation a lot more difficult. In addition, Himalayan balsam, which tends to be a plant that people like to plant in their gardens, is another invasive species, and it poses a threat to the delicate ferns and shrubs of the Acadian forest. To Mi'kmaq people, Point Pleasant Park is a part of the land that is significant importance. It was the location where the Great Spirit Fire, whose spark gave birth to the 7 original families, would sit. And in understanding this and knowing that it is sacred space of creation and cultural significance, the push for the recovery and preservation is not only coming from biodiversity and environmental aspect, but for an understanding and community aspect as well.
We would like to start by acknowledging Dalhousie University for supporting our research in this experiment. We would also like to acknowledge that this research took place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, who have given us the opportunity to live and learn on their traditional lands. We would also like to give a big thanks to Dr. Allison Schmidt and Abigail Target, who helped guide us in our research over the course of the past few weeks. We've provided a list of our references for you, including links to facts used in the introduction, as well as photos used throughout the presentation on the next slide. At this point, we would like to thank you for your attention throughout the presentation, and we hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.